Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on this webinar. And obviously, the coming Sunday, May 17th, is the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, either HOT for short, or which is an international day to raise awareness about LGBT rights. And just before I continue, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jerome. I'm the CEO of Pink Alliance, and welcome everybody. So in Hong Kong, thanks to a series of legal victories, we have made some great strides over the years, but obviously things are still falling short. I guess in the meantime, what can be done is the big question. And one thing that really works is diversity and inclusion measures in the workplace. And this is why we are here today to talk about it, how to move beyond branding and how to make it work for both employers and employees. Now, on that note, I'd like to introduce the moderators of today's discussion. We have Carmen Mock and Katie Ho, both from LinkedIn. Carmen is a solutions manager, and Katie is a customer success manager. Both of them co-lead an internal resource group out at LinkedIn Hong Kong. Both are champions of LGBT plus equality in the wider community. So with no further ado, let me pass the floor to them, Katie and Carmen.
Thank you so much, Jerome, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining our Pink Alliance's first virtual event. We have three panelists with us today, and let me introduce them to you. So first, please say hi, Julia Elliott. Julia is the VP on D&I team in HR at Morgan Stanley. She leads the regional LGBT plus strategy as well as other key initiatives, including, let me introduce them to you. So first, please say hi, Julia Elliott. Sorry, is there a big echo here? We need to turn down. Sorry. Yep, and Julia leads the regional LGBT plus strategy as well as other key initiatives, including return to work, women's mid-career development, and programming for parents and caregivers. Next, we have Adrian Davis. Please say hi. Adrian is the program manager at Community Business. She drives the development strategy and execution of community businesses' LGBT plus campaigns. Adrian was also a member of LGBT plus oriented clubs and volunteered for a disabled sporting NGO before relocating to Hong Kong in 2016. Last but not least, we have Tony Poon from Google. Hi, Tony. Tony is the Hong Kong strategic partner lead for Google and is responsible for driving engaging relationships within Hong Kong's media industry since 2015. Outside of the core projects, Tony worked on various projects at Google, including Google for Nonprofits, helping Hong Kong nonprofits fundraise, collaborate, and spread the message about their causes. Tony is the diversity, equality, and inclusion lead for Google's employee resource group called Gageless, and an active ally for the LGBTQA forces and groups in Hong Kong. Well, welcome all our panelists. And now I'll pass to Katie. And we have a few interesting D&I initiatives questions we want to talk about.
Thank you, Carmen, and love the word gageless. I think that's really good play on the word. Just some housekeeping rules actually for our audiences. Please feel free to give us your question throughout the entire webinar under Q&A, so we can sit back at the end of all our planned questions. So please keep them coming through. But just to warm us up, I'm going to actually ask our panelists to answer one quick question, one rapid fire chat on what's the one good thing that came out of working from home or social isolation, which is really the reason why we're on virtual, we're doing it on virtual today. So I'll start with Tony and then maybe Adrian and then Julia.
All right, thank you, Katie and Carmen, for the kind introduction. That's a tough question, to be honest. And I think for me, when I look back at this time and this moment, it is not necessarily the work from home aspect, but that it is actually a shared moment across the globe. I think there are very few instances where the world feels sort of globally the same thing global phenomenon, but then also locally. And so actually it creates a lot more empathy for folks around the world. That even my colleagues in New York, my colleagues in London, my colleagues in Milan are all sort of facing the same sort of challenges. And from that, we are sharing our best practices, whether on using like virtual calls or how to actually enforce social distance. And so I think that's sort of the positive outlook that I have on this.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and then I think for me, there are two things that kind of spring to mind, positive that came out of it. The first and most maybe immediate to Hong Kong is that I finally got up the nerve to move. So I've moved flats to something that's a little bit bigger and a little bit more spacious and bright. Just in case Hong Kong had to go into isolation or had to be locked in our flats, I kind of realized that I couldn't stand to spend time in my old. I've moved, and then the next is maybe a feeling that can be echoed by some of the callers and maybe the other panelists. I've ended up reconnecting with a lot of groups that I'd lost contact with since moving to Hong Kong, but since my friends in the US have gone into isolation as well, we've been doing a lot of our catch-ups virtually, which has been really cool.
And for me, it actually hits a little bit closer to home. So I've been working from home since Chinese New Year, so late January, and I have 3 kids. And so being able to spend time with them and really engage in the outdoors where I live. And also I was home for my son's first steps, so I didn't have to relive them after a day at the office. So that was a very fun experience.
Wow, that's really good to hear. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. So I think we're going to jump straight into the actual D&I discussion. So first question I'm going to direct to Julia, actually. So what practices has Morgan Stanley have in place to ensure that your D&I initiatives are both curated by and for a diverse group of people? And how do you capture these intersectionalities within these?
Okay, thanks. So at Morgan Stanley, our D&I strategy includes a focus on several diversity dimensions, including LGBT+, family, culture, and gender. And we have employee networks, is what we refer to them as, that represent all of these communities. And the networks welcome membership from the community they focus on, as well as allies. So how this works for our LGBT+ network is through 3 ways. So first of all, we have an ally approach. So Morgan Stanley's LGBT+ strategy focuses on those employees who identify as LGBT+, and also the straight allies who support the community. Secondly, the Pride and Ally Network for the region has divisional representation on the steering committee, which means that the network strategy and all of the programming reflects the interests of the employees across the firm. And thirdly, our communications. So announcements, invitations for network events are all sent to all employees. This allows us to reach employees that may not be involved in the network and to provide access to the content that appeals to individuals. They can engage in whatever activity they are comfortable with. For example, hearing from a leader in an executive spotlight series or volunteering in a community initiative. So if I may, I'd like to share 2 specific examples that illustrate how our LGBT+ network has accomplished a broad offering. So the first is a law and transition series that we have run over a number of years. And this has been offered to address the changing legal landscape of the region. So the series has engaged legal experts across the region to discuss everything from non-discrimination legislation in different countries to marriage equality, and more recently to the QT case in Hong Kong. And then secondly, and more recently, was our participation in Pink Friday Pride last year. So in November of 2019, Morgan Stanley joined over 50 companies from across Hong Kong in celebrating a citywide initiative to dress in pink to visibly show your support for diversity and LGBT+ inclusion. So as a part of that campaign, it was during the social unrest in Hong Kong. So a lot of the external social and networking events were unfortunately postponed or canceled. But we decided to invite all of our employees in Hong Kong to co-create a Pink Friday Pride piece of artwork. So this collaborative event celebrated inclusion and equal love for all. And we encouraged employees to join, dress in pink, and contribute to this piece of art.
Really excited actually about the upcoming Pink Pride, hopefully this year as well. So thank you very much for sharing, Julia. I'm going to actually ask the same question to Tony. It'll be great to hear, initiatives coming from Google. So kind of really more in the technology industry as well.
Great. So it's a tough question. I think in some aspects we don't do it too differently than other companies. But for what you might know of Google is that we are actually a website, a search engine actually. And so a lot of people come to us with questions looking for answers. And there's actually a button on our website which is called I Feel Lucky, which is whatever query that you ask for, whatever question you have, if you click on I Feel Lucky, instead of seeing results, you should just go to that destination. However, the real world for that is actually not so easy. I mean, there's no I Feel Lucky button for finding answers for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what we try to do is take the same approach we have for our search engine, which is we try to be less wrong. Instead of being more right, which is very, very hard to do, we try to figure out what doesn't work and stop doing that. And whatever kind of does work, keep continuing that. So in those efforts, we actually look into diversity, equity, and inclusion in very separate pillars, and they are the major pillars in creating a sense of belonging for all of our colleagues. We believe that actually having a rich, diverse workforce and bringing together views that reflect the rest of the world help us create better products. We believe in equity helps us get better performance out of our colleagues. And that for inclusion is that if everyone has a voice and everyone can share their voice, we can actually sort of, just as we are trying to democratize the internet, we actually share this belief within our organization. So in that, one of the things that we've done in the last 3 years is actually a shareholders report, but on diversity. So, for most listed companies, they'll sort of go back to their shareholders and explain what businesses that they're invested in, how they're doing, how are they performing. We also have that for ourselves and these diversity, inclusion, equity measures. And we actually have a high level of transparency that we don't just share it within our organization, that we share with the rest of the world. So if you just go to diversity.google, so no .com, just diversity.google, you can actually see the website and get the 2020 annual report. And in that, you can find that how we're making progress across these measures. And lastly, we also believe it's up to us. So Google has over 100,000 employees, and 35,000 of us participate in something called the Employee Resource Group. What that means is that it's basically an employee-led group that is instrumental in fostering inclusion and advocating communities within Google and outside of Google. So for example, Gaglers is a group that I lead and participate in. We are actually trying to promote inclusion and diversity in the workplace for LGBT community members, but then also work with Pink Alliance and other members here on the panel to foster that outside of Google as well.
Thank you so much, Tony. Actually, that you see a lot of commonalities across Morgan Stanley and Google in what you're trying to do that are employee-led. So it's very much about inclusion of all colleagues. So the communication goes out to everyone, so they don't have to be part of a ERG to participate, or they can really be quite selective of what is suitable for them and how they want to contribute to the D&I space. So my next question actually is going to Adrian, if that's okay, as kind of a follow-up. So as D&I is becoming more and more of an expectation from employees, so how have you seen businesses, or how have you seen community business itself evolve your practice in capturing the rising expectation of this newer generation? So the fresh graduates, those who are quite early in the career, where they are expecting to see more, D&I is just the new norm. And how do you leverage that experience to drive improvement with your initiatives as well?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll start with saying it absolutely is an expectation from the younger generation that especially big organizations will be thinking about D&I and will be thinking about LGBT inclusion, and that they'll be involved. So one of the things that I see working really well is when people, just directly ask questions and invite young people who are maybe keen, have a lot of energy to the table and asking, what would you like to see? What are your ideas? This is what we've been doing. And then letting them run with it, giving them a little bit of a lead so that they can make those ideas happen. So you're not only bringing in a new group of people, so those young people are going to bring their friends in, but you're also getting you're developing young leaders, and you're helping them in a way that they're not going to fail, you know, so you're giving them the support that they need to really develop themselves. And then another thing that I'm seeing is people are recognizing that you know, your young talent might not be very interested in things like family planning yet. Maybe they're just interested in sort of financial planning and social aspects of the network at first, but they'll want to get that later on. So sort of recognizing what's going to be interesting for them at that time, and making sure that you're offering that content on a regular basis. And then from community business perspective, I think we're a little bit different from Morgan Stanley and Google, because we're much smaller. So what we can do internally is going to be really different than what we'll be able to source, what Google or Morgan Stanley will be able to source. So we can't really often hold LGBT specific events or things. So for us, what that will look like, you know, if I want to, you know, help people understand what LGBT financial planning looks like, I'm going to invite them to a event hosted by maybe Pink Alliance, or an event hosted by one of our network companies, and just have them in the room and invited along. Because to be honest, it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to hold an LGBT specific family planning event when there's maybe 3 people in the office that are LGBT. So it's making those resources available.
Great, thank you very much for sharing. And I think that's quite applicable to anyone who's listening now, who might just be starting out in the D&I space as well. But I'll ask the same question to Tony, because it will look different for Google, you know, companies like Google. So yeah, how have you made the initiative more applicable to the new?
Great. Thank you for the question. To start off with, we actually start this process very, very in the beginning. So from the sourcing of candidates, actually, which I'm sure you will know a lot more of at LinkedIn. But in that, we actually try to make an effort to reach out to traditionally underrepresented groups. A lot of times we'll find that, you know, in tech, right, a lot of the sort of typical profile in tech is probably someone who is male and probably in engineering, study engineering, and would just apply. And we kind of just hire, you know, based on who is the sort of most closest and proximate. That's actually what most companies would do. We actually don't do that. We actually make an inordinate kind of extra effort to go out to sort of find the sort of people who may not apply, just so that we have a balanced view and balanced candidate to reflect the population. And so what does that mean? It means that actually when we write the job description, we notice that when we have a very lengthy job description, that say has more than like 55 words, female candidates actually drop off dramatically and don't apply. And we looked into this and we're like, well, why is this the case? And the case is that I mean, you know, I hope actually most of us here are on HR and work with, you know, talent and people development. But what we noticed is this, is that when a female candidate applies, they actually try to check every box. So they try to check A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then they apply. And so we find that if there's 10 things on the items, most female candidates feel comfortable when they can check 9 out of 10, something like that. Whereas the male candidates, generally, if they check 1 or 2 boxes, they will submit their CVs and apply. And so we noticed this biasing here where, you know, it's just about the reach, right? And so we actually have a computer algorithm that goes through our job descriptions to make sure that they're not biased for one way or the other. So making sure that they're brief and short and that we can attract female candidates. That said, once you kind of come into the funnel and you're, you know, invited for an interview, we don't look at a candidate for a cultural fit, because having a cultural fit basically means you're kind of just like everybody else in the team, right? We look for a culture add, which is what can they bring from their different background and experiences together. And so we've actually formalized this in our sort of recruitment process to call the culture add training. And so we've trained over, I think, something like 2,500 employees who are responsible for interviewing across 150 different offices, just so that we kind of see the candidate for who they are, not to the team that they might fit in. All of this, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion training is core to all of our employees. And there's actually even more extra training for managers because they have a direct impact on a larger number of employees. we believe that for us, representation is a simple equation. It's our hiring and our attrition. So are we bringing in the candidates from traditionally underrepresented groups, and are we retaining them, right? Are we making our efforts that, these groups that come in that, they don't have a higher attrition rate than the average in the company. And so you can actually find this, that we do a lot of data analysis around race, gender, and people who self-identify for their LGBT status as well. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. I think you can actually see quite a nice flow from what Adrian and Tony answered, from making sure the hiring process is adapted to hiring, a diverse group of people who are culturally adding to the company, to actually, opening the floor for them to actually see what they can bring to the table in terms of their comments and communications, and then the attrition part as well. I think there is actually a stats about, 50% of our workforce is going to be millennials by the end of 2020. So I think D&I strategies and initiatives are, being adapted to those demographic is quite crucial for everyone to consider. So as a follow of that, I think, Tony, how do you actually bring all these initiatives or practices into a live company culture? So for example, how do you get the buy-in from the managers, like you talked about, them getting additional training, but how do we make them accountable for actually the execution of the initiatives?
So accountability goes all the way to the top. So it's not something that in, diversity and inclusion is something that is just within the HR department, so to speak, or within sort of recruitment. It is actually everyone's responsibility. And so one of the ways that we measure this is that we have a Google Geist survey. So in many of your workplaces now, it's just an employee survey. So you just have a different branding to it. And we run this once a year and to figure out, one, if you feel like there's a sense of belonging for you. Like when you work at Google, do you feel like you belong? Are you treated well at your role? Does your manager treat you well? So that's sort of something that we call is just the basics, right? And then the second piece is sort of a biannual manager feedback, which is directly to your manager, and you kind of can write, if he or she sort of is accountable or for diversity inclusion. And to those things, it's super important because from that, it's a very full 360 view, and our managers are actually accountable for the performance of this and actually making sure that we're making the right progress. So that's something that I would say is very, very powerful, because I think in most companies, they kind of talk about it. Managers are like, oh, I'm responsible for this, but then no part of their pay, their compensation or incentive have this measure. For us, this is a very, very core value. That said, for folks like myself, we actually run programs called It's Up to Me as well, which is that we foster allyship, right? So there are parts of the world where LGBT causes might not be well known, particularly in Asia, where it's sort of not spoken about and not talked about. And so therefore, for them, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. And what we actually try to do in terms of ERG groups and in terms of Gaglers is that, first of all, we want you to be aware of the cause. We want you to know that the world does actually have this LGBT community. And the second is we welcome you to be an ally. So I myself am actually an ally, and I took this opportunity to actually bring in more allies. As a married straight man, I'm sort of the atypical LGBT lead, but this is what we would want to foster.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. And that actually leads very nicely to our next question, is that this is going to Adrian, actually wanting to see whether you can add something from the perspective of community business. What education is provided, or have you been seeing being provided to those who lead the initiatives, to ensure best practices, and how is the education disseminated through the business as well? So very much what Tony is talking about on the top level, and also kind of amongst employees. Yeah.
So I think maybe I'll start with sort of what I'm seeing sort of more broadly, and then talk about community business in particular. So as far as what education is provided to leaders, it depends on the organization. It depends on how they resource, how their training normally runs. But what I've often seen very successful is you start with a influential senior leader and executive buy-in, especially in some place like Hong Kong. You really need that in order to be successful. You need the budget, you need the influence, you need their name on things, and you need their yes in order to move forward. And then that influential leader, you want to start maybe training the rest of your senior leadership team and your management, while at the same time it's a two-pronged approach. So you're training and you're helping your management team understand, and you're building your grassroots involvement from maybe your more junior employees. But I recognize that getting everyone trained and understanding, unconscious bias and the basics of LGBT is really, really difficult. So what I often recommend is that making that part of your onboarding process. It doesn't have to be really complicated. It doesn't even necessarily have to be its own session, although it's great if it is. But including, statements about how important it is at your organization that LGBT people are included and are respected, and whatever language you use around that, and some basic terminology. How do I be respectful about someone's pronouns? How do I talk about partners versus husband and wife in the workplace, and what is respectful to ask is, I think, really important. And then sort of running ongoing sessions where people who are maybe more curious want to get more in depth, but maybe don't know where to start. So sort of LGBT 201 sessions where they can talk more specifically about particular issues. And then to talk more specifically about community business and what we do, we're small enough that and because of the work we do, everyone kind of has to be a leader on D&I. Community business, I assume most people in the room probably know what we do, but we're an organization that works with businesses and with organizations on their diversity and inclusion policies. So most people on our staff come in with an understanding of what diversity and inclusion is, and then the idea from an LGBT perspective is I help them understand more broadly. And so maybe I help them understand some best practices. I might run a session on that. Just recently, one of my colleagues came up to me and told me quite honestly, and I'm happy that we have this report. She said, I don't know much about terms beyond the L and the G and the B. Can you run a session on that? Can you help me understand? Or she asked, can we have lunch and talk about it? And I said, well, maybe we should bring the whole team in for this, and maybe that's a session that we should have in the wider team. And then for me, as one of the specific LGBT leaders, it ends up going to events such as these where I can learn more about sort of what other companies are doing. I talk to my clients and I say, what are you doing? What's going on? And while I disseminate that information to my client, I also take it in and I see, how can we adjust that? I look at our index and I look and see what are other companies doing and how can we bring that on and help make my own organization better, while adjusting for a much smaller scale than many of the people that we work with.
Great, thank you. And actually a follow-up on that, Adrian. Have you seen anything, because I know community business works specifically within the Asia region, where like said or Julia said, we are a bit more sensitive, maybe we're a bit less progressive in the D&I space. Are there anything in, onboarding or, getting buy-in from your executives that you think are Asia specific that people should watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I hear very often is we don't have any LGBT, I hear stories of executives saying, I don't have any LGBT people on my staff, or they say, we shouldn't be talking about sex at work. To the first, I would say either if you actually don't have any LGBT people on a staff of 200, then you're not hiring the right people, and we need to have a discussion about what your hiring process looks like. And you can have a conversation about why we're not talking about sex, we're talking about inclusion, and we're talking about belonging, and we're talking about, bringing your full self to work. Those are, I think, some common issues. And then some people, I think just genuinely often will have problems with getting senior leaders to understand why diversity and inclusion matters to the business, and why it should be an important aspect of the work that they do. Even though it's not necessarily making money directly, what are the benefits from having a diverse workforce and a happy workforce and an included workforce for the lifespan of your employees, and why is that so important? So those are some of the challenges that I see. There are a lot, but
And that's really nicely, actually, thank you. So my next question actually will probably be quite interesting to people who are starting out in the D&I space. Like myself, I was wondering this as well. So Julia, how do you differentiate and communicate the differences between diversity and inclusion through the business?
Well, I'll start with one of my favorite analogies is actually the difference between diversity and inclusion. So diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is actually being asked to dance. And so how we're addressing this at Morgan Stanley is through education and accountability. I think we've touched on that. Tony touched on that from a Google perspective. But what we look at in training is actually unconscious bias training and inclusive leadership offerings. So in unconscious bias, we're looking at how bias affect processes such as recruitment, advancement, and how those and the training engages employees to understand the role that they play in those processes and how they can disrupt their biases to affect it. And then in inclusive leadership, we're looking at more senior leaders, and it examines biases and micro inequities and the leader's role to manage inclusively. So, and then we also have an Asia Pacific Diversity Council, which drives accountability through all of their businesses and divisions. And we have regular reviews of divisional diversity plans and their KPIs against those, so that there's a regular conversation around not only on what your stats are, so the diversity piece, but inclusion, the stickiness of employees. Are they staying? Are they progressing? Are we hiring them?
And Adrian, would you have something to add to that as well?
Yeah, I love hearing about stickiness, and it's also, one of my favorite phrases is, asked to dance. But I think that one that I saw recently that I think works really well in the business context is just because you were invited to the conference doesn't mean you get to speak or set the agenda. So that's, I think, a big difference between diversity and inclusion. Echo, it's important that you get sort of a wide variety of people's inputs. Check who've made comments and recognize that different people have different ways of engaging. So not everyone is going to want to raise their hand in a big team meeting to give their input or a big brainstorming sessions. That's not everyone's way of communicating. So it's ensuring that you've got ways for different people. And if you're seeing that, you have a variety of people, but these three people are never making or never adding, what you might expect them to. It might be just, talking to them directly and saying, hey, what do you think about this? And really getting some direct feedback. And then once you do get people directly involved, it's communicating how you're getting them involved, so that you get a cycle. I can see, oh, there's someone who looks like me who's getting kudos for this. Maybe I should also interact, and maybe there's a way for me to get involved. Maybe I can add something, and maybe that's through call out posts or kudos, or even there are any number of ways you can do it. And then it's I think also including that difference as part of, like I said, that sort of ongoing D&I training, that onboarding training that I already said that I think organizations should prioritize.
Great. And I think this is a perfect opportunity to, I guess, dive deeper into how we can actually receive feedback, because there's no point of running all these onboarding and training if they're actually not applicable, or they're just not, absorbed by the employees and getting them, motivated. So I thought, like, going to Julia. So how is feedback being encouraged from employees at Morgan Stanley, and how is it captured?
So Morgan Stanley has a culture of feedback. You'll often hear people talk about the camaraderie and the culture of Morgan Stanley. And through feedback, there are formal and informal avenues. So as part of our 360 performance management process, and also through regular manager and employee dialogues. We do have an employee engagement survey that does have specific D&I questions and a sense of belonging, and through divisional representation within our employee networks. So there's an open communication directly to the network committees within the division, and then that feeds up through executive sponsorship and to the Diversity Council, as I mentioned.
Adrian, did you have anything to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the importance of, anonymous surveys, employee surveys, sort of discussion groups with managers can be really a really important way to get feedback, as well as sort of discussion forums and maybe smaller questionnaires. If you do one once a year, maybe it might be wise to also include, a small pulse survey, 1 or 2 questions to just get a read on how people are feeling. But recognizing that there's often a culture of not wanting to feed back in that way, you might just have to ask directly sometimes and have what might end up being a difficult discussion with people, and recognize the dangers that sometimes people feel with giving direct feedback. So, for example, they might be afraid that it will be actioned, that, if they give feedback and it gets back to their manager, that they've given that feedback, that there might be some repercussions for them, even if it's not, losing their job. It could be something like, passed up for a good project or something like that. So building an open feedback loop where people can feel and trust that they can give anonymous feedback and it won't come back to bite them is really, really vital. And I would just say that, I don't think anyone comes to work wanting to do a bad job. And I think most people come in and want their workplace to be better than how they left it. So if you can encourage feedback in a way that allows people to do that thing that most people want to do, then you'll really find yourself in a much better place than you started in.
Great, thank you. And actually a curiosity out of just from myself, actually, whether have you seen any experience with getting feedback from also allies as well? Because we talked about that, actually, Tony especially. So, really to foster, a diverse environment at work, I think it's equally important to kind of do a pulse check with people who might not be directly who are part of the LGBT plus community, but not necessarily, like you said, you are an ally, Tony. So I wonder if there's anything at Google, Morgan Stanley, or community business where you can kind of give advice to anyone else on taking a pulse from allies.
I can take a stab at this one. It's actually quite current for the moment. So for my background that you can see, we at Morgan Stanley, and the week ahead of Ida Hobit, we are running a virtual Wear It Purple campaign in recognition of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia. And what we're doing through that is actually an active ally pledge. And so what we've asked, we've done a lot of engagement of allies, and so much as, come show your support, come to events, wear purple previously. This year we wanted to actually have more of an action-oriented campaign, and also to understand, why allies are choosing to be allies. So we had 8 different pledges that we could take. And you could say what you pledge to do as an active ally. So this included things like use inclusive language, bring up the next generation to be LGBT plus inclusive, join the network and attend an event. We have a number of things, support advocacy. And, so by that, what it's doing is twofold. It's giving allies an opportunity to engage differently. It's allowing them to view their allyship through these different pledges and to be more action oriented. But it's also giving us as the organizers, so the committee and, HR, an understanding of what do people want out of the network? What action do they want to see? So should we be running more events that do engage families, that's about, if it's children, or if it's about advocacy, do we need to be, stepping up our interests in some of the causes that are going on around the region? So that's one example that we're really trying to understand, what do our allies want and how do they want to be involved?
Just to sort of build on what Julia said and Adrian said, I think allyship is very important, not just for LGBT causes, but for all sort of causes. And I'll give you a kind of a funny example, right? So we believe that allyship creates the space for all of us to bring our full self to work. What that means is that, you could, for me, in my case, while I'm in the LGBT community, I'm not LGBT. but I am, I am of a certain age. And so we actually have another group called Greyglers, right? So GREY. And that group is for colleagues that are over 40. What that means is that basically, Google is a very young organization. We're 22 years old. Most of our employees are younger than 30 years old. In our office here, I think the average age is 27. And so for that, some of us on the other end of the spectrum, who might have a little bit more gray hair, we actually don't have a group. There's not enough of us to have a ERG group. But what happens is that by having a very healthy allyship, we can ask questions to other folks and our colleagues. And being a tech company, we have all sorts of acronyms. We have BFMs, we have, CPMs, all these acronyms. But I remember coming across one acronym which was called OOTD, right? Which I have no idea what OOTD is, right? Now, for many of you, I can see that you're laughing and smiling. Trust me, by having allyship and having a healthy sort of landscape, you can ask these questions without feeling very awkward or stupid or whatever, but then actually getting to know more, right? Now, I do know what OOTD is now, but just to let you know, this is what allyship does. It creates a space for you to ask questions, to bring your full self to work, and have that safety to ask these questions and not feel judged.
And I would just echo that. I mean, allies are incredibly important. And I think that in the broader D&I conversation, we sometimes forget that allyship is not just LGBT. Allyship is across the spectrum of D&I. And that you can be an ally even when you're even if you are a part of another, even if you're a part of the initial acronym, you can still be, I'm an ally to the trans community, I'm an ally to the gay men's community. And it's important that dialogue is open and that you have an active ally community, especially in a place like Hong Kong and other places in Asia where people might not be comfortable coming out and often aren't. And so if you have a healthy and strong ally culture, that can let people who are LGBT have a really good reason for coming to the events, even if they're not comfortable coming out, and they may never be comfortable coming out. If you've already created a story that allyship is needed and accepted and wanted in our LGBT group, and just because you come to an event doesn't mean you're LGBT, that creates a space where people can exist without outing themselves, and can exist and ask questions, and it creates a place of safety for people. So I can't stress the importance of allies enough.
Thank you all. And I think it really is the take-home message is that sense of belonging and, that really safetyness of being able to kind of feel, being inclusive in the environment. I love the phrase, bring the whole self to work. I think that's something that we could really all try to kind of push and make sure that all businesses are following through as well. So I'm just conscious of time. So I'm going to end with a last question that goes to all the panelists. So what do you think people often get wrong in starting their D&I practices? So is there anything that you want to kind of bust the myth for, if they are really just starting out in the space? Because I think we talked a lot about action oriented. So that's Julia talking about action oriented. So not just using it as a buzzword, not using it as for branding, but really focusing on what we can do with the community. So maybe we'll start with Julia and then going to Adrian and Tony.
So not to throw too many other buzzwords in there, but it is very important to have a strategy and to have that senior management sponsorship and support. And so what that looks like, I think it's very easy to feel like if you start a network or an ERG group, that feels like something. It feels like activity. It feels like momentum. But if you're launching these groups or you're hosting these events and it's not a part of a broader strategy, and it doesn't then kind of propel into more positive action, then it's just activity and it's not working towards any goal. So I think having that strategic direction from the beginning and understanding all the levers that you can pull to work towards that goal. So networks are just one part of them. I know we focused on them quite a bit today, but as are the processes that we've touched on and the training and all of those. So being able to access those different levers to work towards a strategy.
Great, Julia. And I have to agree on needing a strategy and needing sort of a wider story to what you're doing on LGBT and on D&I in general. But I think that sometimes people wait to get started until they feel like they have everything. So just because you don't have all the answers, just because you don't have everything, all your ducks in a row and ready to go to start now and recognize that there might be bumps in the road, you might make mistakes, and that diversity and inclusion is a process for all organizations. No matter how long you've been doing it, there's always going to be room for improvement. There's always going to be a new challenge, a new thing to do. So get started and make adjustments where you find you need to, or where you can, and as you can. You can't do everything all at once. You can't make all the changes that you want at once. So pick your battles as you go, and get your victories where they come, and be aware that there's a wider community that's waiting and willing to help you. There's a great community in Hong Kong and in the wider Asia region who's just waiting to step in and help you avoid some of the pitfalls that they've found early in their journey, including community business. We're willing to help and want you to succeed and want you to do well.
So I just want to echo what a lot of you have said. I think first of all, for the folks who are participating, you've already made like a huge step. I mean, I think being part of the dialogue, being part of the conversation, and sort of listening and reaching out to Pink Alliance is already like a massive step. And so you can lean on these networks for expertise, best practices. And so that is a good thing. Keep on doing that and continue to do that. But going back to something sort of more practical and more pragmatic, and also scientific, I would say diversity wins, right? Like I have not seen a case where organization is more diverse loses. And I like to illustrate this example. So there's a baseball player named Jackie Robinson, and he was actually one of the first African-American baseball players to play for a Major League Baseball team. Now for that, to imagine sort of a person of color not being able to play in a major league sports today is sort of impossible. But what we can show is that, when we take all this out, what we can bring back is better talent and better possibilities of winning. And a lot of the organizations we work for want to win, whether it's, helping our new business grow, helping our communities grow. That's our goal. And so if you can tie that back to winning, how diversity wins and what you can do about it, that usually makes a very easy case for senior leadership. Then use data to reinforce that. So one of the things that we found out a long time ago was that around sort of gender inequality. And we found that, in many cases, women in tech were underpaid than men. And we asked a bunch of questions. We're like, were the offers that we made to women lower than men? Were the sort of the rates of promotions different? And we quite couldn't figure it out for a while until we isolated to the fact that it was around maternity. It was actually around that, women who were just giving birth, who went on mat leave, sometimes needed more time to ramp up to come back to work. Or sometimes they would consider taking another 6 more months or another some time to, provide for their childcare, given their family situation. And we really dug deep into that. And we found that when we actually took care of, women who were coming off mat leave or taking mat leave, by smoothing that process, we were able to retain women talent. And we found great measures in the last 3 years around this. So we really think that, in this case, when we took a hypothesis, we sort of found some sort of measures in data, and we actually acted on that. We're able to drive a big change, especially around retention. So I ask all of you guys to have organizations start with that. Start with sort of championing diversity at the top of your leadership, but then having 1 or 2 examples of like, this is what we need to fix. Like we need to make sure this type of talent comes into our organization, or this kind of talent never leaves, right? And so that, I hope, are some good practice.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, actually, for all the sharing. These are all the planned questions we have for today's panel discussion. So really thank you, Julia, Adrian, and Tony. So now I'm going to hand it over to Carmen, my colleague, who will be feeding through some of the Q&As or questions that have came through the audience. So if you haven't done so already, please feel free to put it in now as we go on. So over to you, Carmen.
Yeah, thank you so much again for the really inspiring questions, especially on the allyship, because we are both active allies at LinkedIn Hong Kong, but we definitely learn a lot and we can implement, especially like the pledging part from Morgan Stanley into our company as well. So we actually have a trend here in the Q&A. So a lot of people are asking about how do you deal with resistance, whether it's from leadership or like just the company in general, and how to get like the ERG off the ground with all these resistance. Any of you want to answer this? See, Tony, you unmuted yourself.
I'm happy to get to answer both. Getting the ERG started is hard because first of all, it's like I'm gonna prepare myself to do something in front of an audience. I'm not sure if there's gonna be an audience in front, right? So I think it ties to both, executive sponsorship, making sure that this effort that you're going to do will resonate to the leadership team, so that you have some executive sponsor, right? But to sort of get that, what we call like a chapter in a box, reach out to everyone here in the community. I mean, we have our best practices, which we can share, with the Pink Alliance on how to get that done. But just get started. It doesn't have to be a big sort of event. It could be a newsletter. It could be an email. It could be a poster. It could be inviting some of your colleagues to a Pink Alliance event or community business event. It doesn't have to be something that you do on your own to create. We in pre-COVID, we used to hold events at Google for LGBT causes, and we'll probably continue that post-COVID. But just attend and talk and share best practices. So yeah.
And just to add to that, I would say is, it sounds to me like you probably know who you think should be involved, and who you have a sort of an idea of people that you think would be interested. So I think you should probably talk to them and figure out what are the things that are preventing them from coming. Are they actually not interested, or do they think that it's going to be taking away from their work and maybe their manager won't be happy? Do they think that the event that you're offering is maybe not going to be that interesting for them? It's not serving their needs. Do they not know who else is going to be there? Are they waiting for a critical mass? So until you got that direct information, it's going to be hard to keep people coming to your events. If they're not coming naturally. So directly asking people, you told me you're interested in this. Why are you not here? What's going on? Is this in getting that direct feedback? Why are you not inviting your friends? Come on, like that kind of thing you might find helpful.
And if I could chime in, two aspects that I think help to at least address this. I think you're never going to be able to solve for resistance, because sometimes you can't change people, but what you can do is you can offer opportunities for them to learn, and you can invite them to come along. So I think they're depending on the organization, that can come in the form of senior sponsorship. So if you have somebody quite senior opening an event, or kind of sending out those communications, that gives a stamp of it where of respect in a hierarchical culture like Hong Kong, that does carry a lot of weight. So I think that senior sponsorship in any of its form, particularly allyship, and also looking at different angles. So people might think that this doesn't relate to me because I'm straight, or sexual orientation has no place in the workplace. But when you maybe tie it in with a family, and talk about kids, that makes it all of a sudden very relevant to parents who maybe have never thought about how to address if their child might come out to them, or their kids' friends, are transgender and have different gender expressions. Helping parents have those conversations is actually one of the best ways to build an allyship. And I think it might take somebody away from kind of traditionally thinking that this is down the LGBT track, because it very much squarely sits in like the parenting bucket. So I think thinking of different ways to align the different focuses of your LGBT or of your diversity strands, whether that's across women, gender. I think LGBT tends to really work well with culture, family. You can really kind of combine it anyway, and that brings different people once again to the table around those conversations.
Thank you so much for all your sharing. I actually have a very interesting, very good question from John Lau here. He asks, how do you start an LGBT plus network or allyship in jurisdictions where LGBT is not legal or accepted?
Maybe start. So I think it depends on what jurisdiction you're talking about, what way you should go. And I can't give as much of a, this is the 3 steps you should take. But in many jurisdictions, in Asia at least, not all, many, probably start with building a culture around, just because you are supportive of LGBT is not breaking the law. At this business, we are supportive of LGBT, even if the law in this jurisdiction it makes it illegal. And this is the culture of our business across the globe. This is what we're doing. And so starting to build that, and you will face challenges that are different from places like Hong Kong, but those are a couple of sort of initial steps you can take. But it is a little bit of a different beast.
Just on our side, we operate in many markets where sometimes we kind of have different views from the governments that we operate in. And so in that, it's a very fine line. Don't break the law. That's the first one. So that's not a good thing. But we do have a set of standards, right? So we often say that, the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. And so for us, we don't tolerate a lot of things like degrading others, bullying, things like that. It's just, there's no law saying that's okay, right? But we don't accept that. And so what's really important for us is that we always try to create an inclusive workplace where, for example, there may not be legislation or there may be legislation in the market against sort of LGBT causes, but there's no legislation against, being old at work, right? Or ageism. But so that, we try to have the best practices around creating inclusiveness first before looking at sort of the nuances of different ERGs and different groups.
That's great. I think that leads in very well to the next question from Lisa Low. There are some limited inclusive practices in the school and education system, especially in Hong Kong and in Asia. Do you find that there's a gap or paradox between the workplace inclusion and the actual society itself? Quite a difficult question here.
Well, I can jump in. It's probably a little bit more anecdotal, but what we're seeing actually, particularly through some of our engagement of our employee networks, is that, there's a lot of hope put on the next generation. I think kids, in schools, you commonly hear that I have colleagues with friends whose kids are identifying, different than their assigned sex. They may have already transitioned, socially, identifying as, a lesbian, gay, or bisexual at a, age appropriate age. And it's all very normal. It's been quite normalized in kind of that generation. Or so those that are maybe in high school at the moment. I think what concerns us is, I think, and that what we look at is that the statistic of people going back into the closet when they come into the workforce. That to me is where the concern is. If you've grown up your whole life and you've had your education and your university of openness and your true self, to come into a workplace culture that doesn't encourage that, that's what we try to address. So through everything that Tony mentioned of openness, inclusiveness, and that allyship culture, so that hopefully people can, start from day one and not have to feel that they have to redefine themselves over the course of their career. So I know that's one approach of it. I think, you're going to see different engagements depending on country, depending on education stream that we do go, that, your children are going through. What we do to try to address it at Morgan Stanley is some of those conversations that bring the different groups together in the segments, whether it's multiculturalism or parenting groups, to just address some of those different questions and different cultural norms.
Yeah, thank you so much for your sharing. We actually have a lot of people who are interested in the cultural ad that Tony mentioned earlier. Instead of like having a cultural fit, you mentioned that Google implements this cultural ad. Can you elaborate a little bit more for our audience here?
Sure. So for us, what cultural ad means is that we look into the diversity with the existing team, and we kind of figure out, okay, like, is this team representative of the market? You know, if we have, for example, you know, a number of sort of colleagues that are sort of, you know, one group, do they represent, you know, the rest of the world? Now, when we look at that sort of in that lens, we can actually sort of find different types of ad. I mean, gender and race are generally top of mind, but there are other things that we have measures on. So for example, we actually internally have other groupings. Basically, you know, are you very numerically driven? Are you a very leadership driven? Are you a community driven? Or are you someone who is a consensus builder, right? These are all, we think that when you have the balance of these, what we call colors, we have a stronger team that is more unified and can work and thrive better together. So culture ad can be many, many different dimensions. The most important part is to look out for it, to be mindful that you're not just hiring a replacement, like, okay, so-and-so left, let's hire the exact same person who fit that. Because like, you know, to use another sports analogy, that's not really how it works, right? You try to build a team that is very, very strong based on the market. And sometimes that's how you build stronger teams. So yeah. But I actually, to be very honest, I like the question earlier, if I may just shed 2 minutes around the institution part, because I found it kind of ironic that people brought institutions to say, you know, the institutions that we have, how do we change that and so forth. I actually think schools and institutions is training ground for society, right? So, you know, many of us attend schools to learn so that we can contribute to society in the workplace. And in some aspects, what we learn in the workplace, because, you know, many of us spend long careers for decades, is really important. So I would say to, you know, lean on each other internally in your organizations to share best practices around diversity and inclusion, and try to make change in the communities outside of the workplace. Just think of, you know, you're attending school, you're attending work, but then making a change in your communities outside. And that's how you can magnify your impact.
And I think anecdotally, just building on that, I've also heard about people who learn about LGBT inclusion and D&I in the workplace, and then they're able to go back and educate their families and the people that are living with them. And so, you know, even if, you know, the work that I do, I can't really impact necessarily what schools are doing, but I can make an impact where I can, and I can help educate where I can, and help give people the knowledge that they can then be advocates in the wider society.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So I'm conscious of time, so we have, I think, 2 more questions here. So this is from Anthony Wall. He wants to know if there are any LGBTQ inclusion strategies that you hope to implement, but practically impossible in the Asian environment. Are there any strategies that you want to put in place? Yeah.
So a couple that sort of off the top of my head, and some organizations are able to implement them, but some have more difficulties, are things like getting insurance for people who have HIV and AIDS. You know, some companies have a really hard time getting, you know, employment benefits for the dependents of a same-sex spouse if you know, they can't technically prove the relationship. So those kinds of things can sometimes be a challenge in regions where LGBT inclusion is not, you know, as, I guess, mainstream, and is not as legal in other places. So those are the 2 that kind of spring to mind of challenges.
Hey, thank you. So I just realized I have a couple more questions coming in from the Q box. This is directed to Tony, and from Mike Kong. I love how D&I is built into the manager accountability at Google. So how did this process start at Google? And did this come across any resistance? And if so, how was the resistance resolved?
So thank you for the question, Mike. I appreciate it. Yes, there is resistance, to be very honest, because I think a lot of times when we come to work, we might be hired to do a certain job, right? But then we actually have other expectations tied to that role. And so, it depends on sort of the fit of that person, because sometimes that person might have come in some time ago before we've done a lot of these D&I changes and so forth. But there are two things to watch out for. One is the measure is the same for everybody, which means that if you are managing a team of 5 people or a team of 5,000 people, or if you are like Sundar, who is managing a team of 100,000 people, that is the same measure, right? So everyone has a voice who is sort of reporting into that organization. And we actually particularly look at this at the levels, at the very, very senior levels. And by that, we look at it for our APAC leadership, we look at for global leadership. And we actually find that two things, the short-term and long-term. If those measures on D&I aren't good, there are sort of short-term penalties, right? So you might not get, compensated as much as you could have gotten. That's one. But the long-term impact is actually quite serious. The long-term impact is actually around progression. Imagine yourself kind of, having an APAC leadership role, and you're looking to bring on, your direct reports who have, 2 teams. One is known for fostering good teamwork, good inclusion, and the other doesn't have the same track record. Who would you promote? Who would you want to bring onto your team, right? And so we find that, there are some short-term and long-term measures and results. But that said, it has to come from the top. It has to be, the C-level, the C-suite to say, this is something that we need to do. We need to look at this consistently. Maybe in the first year, there are no penalties. But if you track enough of this over time, you can definitely find that those leaders who promote diversity and inclusion have better teams that bring their full self to work, who feel more confident to share more about sort of the problems at work or the opportunities, and overall perform better. And we just know we have like piles of science behind that. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Tony. I have another question for Julia. It's on your amazing party analogy, how you said diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is more on the stickiness, on people being asked to dance in the party. So this person asks, how then do you include the equality part with this diverse group of people?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
After inviting all these diverse people into the company, so how do you include the equality part between this diverse group of people?
So this actually kind of goes quite back to echo some of the things Tony said. So I mean, you'll often hear that Morgan Stanley is we are merit based, and everything is all of our processes applies the same to everyone from our chairman and CEO down to the analysts and associates that go through the program. So going through those review processes, going through, having culture conversations, having our feedback processes, those look the same. So once everyone's kind of in the door, you have the same chance at success, throughout the organization.
I'm so sorry. I think I misread it. It says equity, not equality. Yeah. But that's all of the questions that we have. Anybody else got any additional questions? Yes. Yeah, I think that's really inspiring. Like, thank you so much for all your sharing. Like, us from LinkedIn, our ERG is quite new in Hong Kong, so we definitely learned a lot in creating a good allyship. So I'll pass it back to Jerome to close this session.
Thanks, Katie and Carmen. I guess first of all, thank you for joining us today. I do hope that you find the discussion useful. So please do visit our website for some additional resources. Peak Alliance is committed to building relationships with partners and allies in advancing LGBT+ equality, So do drop us a note at events@pinkalliance.hk if you are interested to explore collaboration or learn more about us. But something is quite interesting. I mean, when we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and actually at Pink Alliance, we host a monthly business networking event called FINS. It's usually on the third Tuesday of every month, but the next one, because of COVID-19, we're making some adjustment. But basically, I mean, it's really a good way to meet members of the community and allies and just have a chat and see, you know, what could be done. Or, I mean, we talk about the power of allyship, and I think this is certainly a good way to learn more and to start making friends. Now, there's another way we at Pink Alliance is working on is an online initiative called Eco Love. So it's an initiative that rallies support for marriage equality in the Hong Kong business community. Currently, there are almost 60 names on the list. I mean, there are lots of very like well-known companies on the list, and I think we need more names. And so please visit ecolovehk.org if you want to learn more or if you want to sign up, and simply if you want to find out who's on the list. And before you leave, please complete the feedback form. The link will show up a bit later once we officially end the webinar. Or now you can write it down. It is bit.ly, bit.ly/IDAHOT20. So on that note, I would like to thank our moderators, Carmen and Katie, and our speakers, Adrian, Julia, and Tony, for sharing their insights. And really, of course, a big thank you for you, you know, to come online and participate in this discussion. And we look forward to meeting you at our next event. And goodbye, and have a good one.